So over December, Warhammer 40K got an absolute mountain of new content, but in this video let's sort through it. Which of the new rules and detachments are looking strongest and weakest, or most fun or boring to use in-game. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're ranking every single faction's new rules in 40k, going through the Grotmas Detachments one by one, and talking about what sort of impact they might have on the tabletop for their armies. I feel like out of Games Workshop's big detachment rollout, broadly speaking I think they did at least fairly well. A lot of new armies genuinely got new archetypes that could be at least somewhat fun to play, not all of them cutting edge competitive or anything, though some of them certainly look like they might be, but I feel like if you made a detachment usable and have a different sort of army archetype from how they were playing in their index, then a lot of people are still going to get plenty of value out of it, with a new and fun way to play their army. In this video then I thought we'd talk through each of them, very roughly what they do, highlighting the detachment's core rule, and just talking over very briefly about what some of the stratagems and enhancements do that are more notable, but I don't want to deep dive into every single one, there's far too much. And then just talk a little bit about how they might rate versus the current index or codex detachments that are most commonly played in terms of power. And also for a bit of context, take a look at a few viewer voted scores, going by at least public perception of what people are broadly thinking are either looking strong or fun, both rated out of 5. There's absolutely loads to cover here, so I'm definitely going to brush over a whole bunch of subtleties. Feel free to share any insights you might have about each of these. I look forward to all the discussion down in the comments. In any case though, let's jump straight into it, talking through the detachments in a very rough order of power. First up, and perhaps one of the biggest losers of the Grotmas Detachment rollout, were the Imperial Agents Veilblade Elimination Force. I feel like they were always going to be a struggle really, just given that Games Workshop haven't really given them the tools to have their standalone army work on its own right. The Veilblade one is the assassin themed one, which is definitely fun. The core rule basically means that they can use their once only ability twice if they have one. They must take their upgrade enhancement thing and pay a whole load of extra points for it, including a super sniping Vindicare, and then they get a bunch of stratagems, assassins re-rolling wound rolls versus a character, infantry not being shot at greater than 18 inches, assassins at 6 inches. The Collector's Assassin can be fairly savage with the damage 3 shots, and there's a sort of charge in the enemy turn 1 for 1 command point. I think the idea of theming a detachment around assassins is really quite fun, though just always sounds like that's going to be hard to balance, as they're just ridiculously fragile infantry models that already cost a lot of points and you usually don't want too many of to start with. The biggest thing that struck me for this one are that the enhancements are kind of ridiculously overcosted, having to pay huge amounts of points for what they do, and they probably should have just been flat out free really, I think. Otherwise, beyond that, a couple of the supporting stratagems are quite nice, but as mentioned, Imperial Agents just don't really have the army to go with it. Games Workshop not giving them any help out in the balance update. They really need something like a core detachment rule, or access to a few more units that can destroy enemy tanks beyond allied knights. Versus the other detachments, I'd rate it as one of the weakest. I'd certainly say it seems worse than the movement tricks of the Imperialist fleets. That still looks like that'd be the go-to Imperial Agents one if you want to try and make them work. And it was pretty much slammed in the viewer votes, voted power rating of 1.6, fun factor rating significantly higher than that at 2.6. I feel like that one would have actually been quite high if they'd managed to make this workable, but I guess it's not really very fun if it's an assassin detachment that arguably makes your assassins worse, just due to the sheer amount of points that you have to get for some slightly borderline upgrades. Next up, another one that really didn't go down too well was the Thousand Suns Hexwarp Thrallband. The core rule for this one gives you zones of control. You always get your deployment zone and then you've got to hold objectives in the midboard, and if you do then it becomes within your flow of magic and you get +1 to wound for psychic attacks. For stratagems they've got a sticky objective, a fallback shoot and charge and flow of magic, a 6-inch deep strike and flow of magic, strip cover and gaining stealth, and some of the enhancements can power up their sorcerers quite well. +3 attacks to psychic weapons, always counting as in the flow of magic for their unit, and a 6-inch range to their rituals. I think people just found this one super disappointing, I think mainly because of how similar it was to the index detachment, very focused around psychic shooting sort of things, which definitely isn't the worst idea for Thousand Suns, that is a big part of what they do, but we kind of already have a detachment that really focuses on that, and it basically just seems like the same thing but worse, a whole bunch of anti-synergy. Things like the +1 to wounds not stacking with Magnus, and you might not be able to get the 6-inch deep strike anywhere particularly useful. As it goes, it just seems like it's better to go with the standard index detachment, take the easy psychic damage buffs which also affect Magnus and a bunch of other things, and not being quite so reliant on taking objectives just literally to access your detachment rule, rather than doing so when it makes sense in the phases it makes sense to. As a result, I'd rate it weak. You guys voted it a bit more powerful than the assassins, but a bit less fun. Again, just feels like they probably could have done something a bit more creative than this one, rather than just psychic shooting again. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Toy Snowman. a hobby and gaming store in Canada who's been branching out into Warhammer 40K recently and wanted to share that they're selling miniatures at 15% off Games Workshop's prices for those looking to land things a bit cheaper than their web store. They can do all the normal things that you expect out of Warhammer 40k discount retailers. They've got free shipping over $150 Canadian, posted via UPS during the postal strike, and can do back orders on request from Games Workshop if they have something that's not in stock that you'd like to get a bit cheaper. They've got a pretty easy to navigate website, which I'll link down in the video description if you want to check it out. If there's things there that you can't see, then as mentioned, you can email them to order it in. One thing that a few people might be interested though is they currently have the out of stock Brutal and Cunning set. Still a few copies left at time of recording at least, with the Orcs versus the Ratlings. That was sold out at the Games Workshop web store a while back, so I'd imagine that these ones might not last too long if they're being discounted. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description below. Getting back to those detachments though, and next up we have the Plague Legion of Nurgle. This one gives you a 9-inch Shadow of Chaos around Nurgle units, and you can hand out an additional battle shot test to try and trigger some mortal wounds or deny points in both players' command phases. They've got stratagems for faster play bearers, 2 command points to revive a beast, a couple of ways to hand out some extra battle shock, and a couple of damage boost ones. Maybe one of the most interesting enhancements is the ability to destroy a model if a battle shocks fail within 6 inches, a sort of Be'lakor-esque one that means the units can't be shot outside of greater than 18 inches, and the AP one is quite nice on Nurgle units too, many of which have sort of middling AP. In general, the internet reaction to this one just wasn't really very good when it came out. Battleshock rules in 10th edition always tend to be a bit on the unreliable side, even if there's a direct way to hand out some extra mortal wounds via Shadow of Chaos here. It's just not all that much reliable damage when your opponent's still got around about a 50-50 chance to wind up passing those tests. You definitely could stack a lot though with things like Bile Pipers and Skull Cannons, and if your opponent is a lower leadership faction, then there's a good chance he could deny a whole bunch of points here. And I feel like there genuinely could be some interest in a sort of grindy scoring game with Nurgle taking the mid-board objectives with a bunch of tough stuff, and otherwise trying to deny as many primary points. I'd say there's maybe a bit more interest than a couple of the other previous ones perhaps, though I'd still say that probably the core Chaos Demons jumping on and off the board Warp Portals type detachment I think is a bit stronger than this, even if the Battle Shock shenanigans are a bit stronger than they are for certain other armies out there. Viewers scored this fairly low on both counts as well, a fun factor of 2.5 and a power rating of 2.3. Next up, we've got the Sisters of Battle in the Adepta Sororitas Champions of Faith. This is the one where you get to burn your precious miracle dice to empower Sacrosancts, Battle Sisters or Paragon suits, giving them +1 move, +1 leadership, and +1 weapon skill and ballistic skill, and Sacrosancts just get OC2 in the detachment. For stratagems, you can give them sustained or lethal hits when they're righteous, a -1 to hit in melee, boosted powers in and consolidate, an extra +1 strength and extra AP if they're righteous in melee, and a fallback shoot and charge if righteous. For enhancements, there's an ignores modifier one, and one way to make a Canoness or Palatine fairly fighty with extra damage. This one definitely felt like a bit of a miss of a detachment to me. I think the theming is actually really quite nice. Elite style detachment that make the Celestian Sacrosanct strong I think would be really quite cool if it existed, but this probably isn't it right now. It worked kind of horribly with the Miracle Dice nerf, where it'd still be a big tax on your resources then, but now you've got around about half of them flying around, it's just going to be even worse and kind of unworkable. And I feel like the Celestian Sacrosancts are still maybe a bit too fragile when they're out in the open to really be used in the way that a lot of shield line infantry for other factions could be. Even if probably the most interesting thing in this detachment is that they can hit quite hard, the extra strength and AP stratagem in particular works really well for them. It just doesn't really feel like the detachment does all that much for Paragon Warsuits and regular Battle Sisters, particularly with the Paragons able to get either Val rerolls or the +1 to hit against vehicles anyway, to the point where the detachment rule's not that great for them. Overall though, I'd certainly rate it weaker than things like Hallowed Martyrs and the more nerfed Bringers of Flame. I'm not even particularly convinced it to be all that interesting at pre-nerf Miracle Dice as well. Sisters do have a few fun ways to spend even weaker ones. Again, this one got pretty bad scores on the votes, 2.5 on the fun factor and 2 on power rating. Next up, for the craft worlds, we've got the Aeldari Armoured Warhost. This one's the Grav Tank flavoured detachment, the assault keyword for vehicles, and fly ones can reroll advances, so they can go super fast. And then they've got a bunch of vehicle support stratagems, a fallback and shoot one, a 6-inch deep strike one, a fairly punchy damage one with reroll a hit, wound and damage, and you can advance transports and then drop units out of them. The enhancements feel fairly interesting as well, giving you things like +1 to hit or healing nearby vehicles, a redeploy one and a farming command points one. Perhaps the main issue with this one feels like the core rule maybe doesn't give you quite so much, given that the Aeldari tanks are really fast already and don't necessarily want to be rushing right to the front lines to get destroyed. It just feels like extra speed isn't the primary thing that they need versus more damage and defense. As a result, it seems like the core index attachment just seems far better even for a full grav tank spam army. Getting all of those free rerolls on big scary guns is rather nice. I feel like with a bunch of the rules they don't really seem all that much fun or different as well. Just some merely okay support stratagems. I guess some of the character ones could be alright to have some jet seers running along supporting the tanks and vehicles maybe. In any case, currently it feels super weak to me. I'd rate it as weaker than the battle host. Maybe the codex might change some things though, particularly if that detachment gets nerfed. For this one you guys rated it as a little bit more powerful than it is fun, though still pretty low on both counts. Next up, we've got the Space Wolves with the Champions of Fenris. Their core rule was a 3-inch charge in the enemy fight phase, kind of similar to old-style heroic intervention, so a bit of an exclusion zone around their melee units, and +1 OC for Terminators. Their stratagems were broadly locked to infantry, a nice usable damage one, giving them either lethal or sustained hits when shooting or fighting, Armour of Contempt, stealth for infantry, a sticky objective one, and a return Terminators to reserve. The enhancements all felt merely okay, a 6-inch detachment rule, Terminators forcing desperate escape, re-rolling charges, and fallback shoot and charge, all of them seeming kind of usable for the points cost, though certainly wouldn't say crazily strong. Overall, it just feels like a detachment that's just kind of mediocre throughout. The stratagems and enhancements aren't terrible, but the core rule I think just will be a very low impact one in game. The main reason is that it just only seems to be good for stopping weak units moving up onto the midboard and stealing an objective off you without having to fight you in close combat. Otherwise it just doesn't really feel like it'd come up that much. Melee units can just charge you from outside that range, and most ranged units won't typically want to venture into that. It might not even always stop objective stealing if your unit isn't right in the centre of it as well. I guess it might have the most impact if your opponent doesn't see it coming and it's a bit of a gotcha moment, though that's not exactly a great feeling. Overall, I feel like this one's just really not going to compete very well at all against the Champions of Russ with its active saga right to start with, and then the opportunity to gain more. Plus the buffs aren't locked to infantry only, so good for other things like Thunderwolves or Outriders maybe, though both of those are very happy in their Stormlance detachment too. For viewer votes, this one was voted very low on the power rating at 2.3, a bit higher on fun factor at 2.7. Next up, we've got the Tzeentch Demons in the Scintillating Legion. This one definitely had the fun factor, though I'm personally really not convinced that it adds up to much strength at all. The core rule basically has you ping rerolls from you to your opponent and back again. I guess the minigame being to try and influence the game more powerfully with those rerolls as you go along. Could be good if your opponent doesn't have any enormous things that they can convert really valuably to, but if they've got some big heavy guns that really like those rerolls, they might get more advantage out of your own detachment rule than you do. Otherwise, for stronger stratagems, there's a +3 strength and +1 AP one to ranged weapons, though that is 2 CP and a flux token, so it comes at a very high cost, a shoot and engagement one, and a return to reserves one that you can do with 2 Tzeentch units in engagement range, which is kind of interesting, meaning that you won't get locked in combat. For the enhancements one, maybe the most interesting ones. Feel like the opportunity to gain an extra flux token if the opponent has any. Some more flexible shooting and lines of sight for a Lord of Change, and a big +2 strength, +1 AP and +1 attack to a Demon Prince, making a Tzeentch one really quite fighty. I think the biggest turn off for me for this one is those rerolls often helping your opponent more than you, and otherwise you're just spending flux tokens as an extra tax on those stratagems too. The best things maybe feel like that return to reserve, the Smash Prince, and the extra token enhancement. And it's definitely not nothing, but just doesn't really feel like it's on par with the core Demons one. Personally, I rate this one as really quite fun but pretty weak. It seems that people do disagree a little bit with that one though. They've rated it 3.1 for power and 3.9 for fun factor. Maybe I'm underestimating the Tzeentch units warping out of melee and striking again wherever they want. I guess we'll see if anyone manages to do well with this one at tournaments. Moving onwards and upwards with the detachments, these are the ones that have ranked more sort of weak to usable. And first up, we've got the Imperial Knights Questor Forgepact. I feel like realistically this one still doesn't enormously work well. The idea is that you can ally Admech Skitarii troops with a few tech priests to Imperial Knights. The Knights will heal 1 wound or more near a tech priest, and the Admech get to reroll 1 to hit and wound if near Knights, but given that you can only take Skitarii troops, they're still not really super great damage dealers, even with that on the go, and their Doctrine or Imperatives, which I think they do still get actually. There's a few fun stratagems for the Knights: ignore modifiers, advance and shoot, and overwatch with 1 weapon, which could be kind of big for a Valiant. The stratagems are for an extra 4 wounds, reroll hit rolls of 1 for 20 points, which is fairly good, and a lone operative tech priest with some boosted healing. Overall, I do feel like it's got some perks, getting sticky objectives, high objective control, troops choices for a bit cheaper, Definitely feels like a win for the Knights. Lone Skitarii Marshals could be handy enough for doing actions, and it does have some good stratagems, though I feel like losing the 6+ Feel No Pain and Rotate Ion Shields from the Index Detachment is kind of a lot to overcome here. Plus it's only going to be relevant to a very small amount of players out there. Admech and Knights do feel like a good fit together, at least lore and flavour wise, but not that many people have both. For the votes, it looks like you guys are rated at a 2.7 for power rating, a bit ahead of some, though still definitely below average, but a bit higher on the fun factor rating. Having options for Knights and Admech in a few different formats is pretty cool. Next up, we've got the Leaguers of Votann Hearthband. This one gives you reroll hit rolls of 1 in engagement range or when you're shooting the closest enemy unit with non-blast weapons, and then you also get boosted AP for a Karl Uthala Destined or Einhir Hearthguard unit, which are definitely the most relevant here. For the stratagems, you can get a very scary rapid fire 1 plasma guns with the Einhir Hearthguard, which just doubles their damage at range, which is pretty nice. A 4+ invulnerable save for a Karl or Hearthguard unit, a 6-inch Pile-In and Consolidate, boosted damage against monsters and vehicles for 2 CP, a 4-back shoot and charge, and a 6-inch deep strike. The enhancements maybe feel a bit more mid. There's a -1 to hit that can be given out by a Karl at range, and a +2 wound Einhir champion, which would be quite sturdy. Overall, I certainly wouldn't say it's particularly strong. It just seems more limited than the Index Detachment, and not particularly interesting either. Quite a lot of overlap with the same sort of stratagems, but just doesn't really feel quite as good. For my own rating, I gave it a weak to usable, though I'd err towards the weaker side of things. I think it's definitely worse than the Index Detachment, but might not be crazy amounts worse if you have a fairly heavy skew towards the Hearthguard, which aren't exactly a bad unit, particularly in small squads. I feel like it might be a detachment that does a bit better at 1,000-point games versus 2,000 though. It seems that you guys weren't really particularly impressed with it, either on a fun factor or a power sort of rating, giving it 2.4 for each. The fun ratings were a bit higher on average versus the power ones in general, so this one does feel like it was regarded as particularly boring compared with most of the rest. Next up, we've got some Black Templar Litanies with the Wrathful Procession. This one's for infantry and mounted units, where each round you get to choose either extra 2-inch moves and +1 advances, +1 strength in melee, or a 5+ invulnerable save at range. They've got some stratagems for reroll 1s and ignore modifiers in melee, a 3-inch fight for getting more people into the battle, precision in melee, and switching out a litany to one of the others, plus Armour of Contempt of course. The enhancements again maybe feel a bit mid for their points cost, as devastating wounds for a chaplain, a stealth for a unit, and a once per battle fights first, which is really quite powerful but also fairly pricey. For this one, it just feels like it's really quite similar to the Index Detachment, though I'd certainly not rate quite as strong. I'd say if anything, the +2 movement seems like the single most interesting thing, as it just means that you could have a lot of Templars running around with an 8-inch move, though they didn't get any sort of advance and charge. Beyond that though, the other bits just feel a bit less impressive than the core detachment. You swap out often a 6+ Feel No Pain all the time, and the ability to flex into lethal or sustained hits or anti-psycho when you needed it. The stratagems broadly feel a bit weak to me. I think maybe the precision one is actually one of the most interesting, and that could be impactful. And Fights First could be scary enough on some Sword Brethren or a Crusader squad maybe. Overall to me it just didn't really strike me as one of the stronger detachments. It just feels quite clearly behind Righteous Crusaders, even if not hugely so. Definitely seems one that you could try out in some casual games though. Definitely feels like there's some fun factor to some very fast moving infantry compared with normal. You guys gave it a 3 stars for fun factor and a 2.8 for power. Next up, we're getting into the detachments that I'd rate as a bit more usable. Probably these ones still not going to be the top thing compared with their Index Detachment, but I feel like a bunch of them have maybe a bit more draw than some of the previous. First up, we've got the Death Guard Flyblown Host. This one gives you 5-inch scout on your on-foot infantry, and stealth for infantry units too. Both of those seem broadly good things for Terminators or Plague Marines foot slogging, which are strong units but often tends to get into the battle either in Rhinos or Deep Strike. For their stratagems, they get a boosted pile-in, multiple infantry shooting buffs, an infantry sort of tank shock sort of thing which gives out a few more mortal wounds, and a -1 to wounds near Blight Haulers, which could make Plague Marines or Blight Lords a lot trickier to remove. The Death Shroud would normally have it anyway. For the enhancements, there's quite a fun Bearer regenerating all lost wounds, which seems problematic on a big tough Lord of Contagion running solo or something. A 1 to stop a unit from being shot within 18 inches, which definitely sounds disruptive to a unit advancing up on foot. I'd say maybe one of the biggest weaknesses for the detachments is that it just really seems to want to make Blight Lord Terminators work, but at the moment they're just really quite underpowered versus the Death Shroud, and I feel like for all the good stuff that I think it does do, getting the scary Death Guard infantry to the mid-board straight away is really quite nice. It's going to be competing against the boosted contagions in the index, with the either -1 to hit or the extra AP up close. Both of those are really powerful, plus some other nice damage boosts like sustained hits. Overall I would say that the index detachment probably adds more, I feel like this one's not so far behind that you couldn't use it. You guys voted it a 3.2 for power and gave it a fun factor rating for 3.5, and I must admit it did feel like it had a bit more interest than a few of them and a bit more creativity. Death Guard fighting under a massive cloud of flies. Next up, we've got the Genestealer cult's final day, which is their allied detachment with the Tyranids. Their rule is that you can ally in Tyranids Vanguard Invader units for up to half the army, and the Tyranids can give you a +1 to hit for Genestealer cults, and Tyranid synapse things can sap some health from nearby Genestealer cults if it makes sense to. Their stratagems often rely on coordinating, though are fairly powerful. A reroll all wound rolls in the fight phase for a Genestealer cult unit nearby Tyranids is fairly nice. There's one to extend the Catalyst buff range, a fall back and shoot or charge for Nids. A slain Tyranid character can permanently buff Genestealer cult damage, and a fairly nice return to reserve, which is pretty nice for the Genestealer cults, I think. You also have enhancements to prevent overwatch, a sustained hits 1 for Genestealer cults using Catalyst, a Tyranid melee buff, and a better synaptic parasitism one that makes it a bit more usable. I must admit I do like the fun factor of this one. I think it's just kind of cool to think of the last throws of the cult as the Tyranids come down to devour the planet. It maybe just takes a bit of thinking, and the damage boosts require a bit more setup compared with some of them, but I feel like a bunch of the Vanguard Invader organisms do seem to be in a good place to deliver it, with a bunch of useful lone operatives. The return to reserves feels quite big, a bunch of the damage things are quite nice, and you still be able to have just as many units recycling with Cult Ambush, even if you have only half an army worth of Genestealer cult. It definitely feels a little bit harder to play with compared with some though, and in general the Genestealer cult detachments are seeming fairly strong and look like they're still going to remain so after the changes. It still looks like the Genestealer cult army is going to actually have to carry the damage output, given that the Vanguard invaders don't tend to be quite as brutal as some of them. In any case, looks like there's enough there to be interesting. You guys voted it a big 4 out of 5 for fun factor, one of the top ones there, and a sort of lower middling 3 out of 5 for power rating. Next up, we've got the Chaos Knights Iconoclast Fiefdom. This one's the one where they fight alongside some damned units from Codex Chaos Space Marines, and the core rule is all about sacrificing those cultists to the knights, give them either sustained or lethal hits for some big powerful shooting or melee. They can also empower their damned units to fight a little bit harder, with reroll ones to hit and wound, which could be nice enough on accursed cultists. They've got a few nice stratagems, including advanced shoot and charge for knights, the ability to shoot into melee with a damned unit, knights healing when they slay nearby units, and recycling a damned unit so you can have another wave of cultists walk onto the board. For their enhancements, they've got one that can give them both a sustained and lethal hits at the same time, 3 damned units scouting 6 inches, which seems very nice for night board control, a 6+ feel no pain one, and the ability to take sacrifices at longer ranges if they're scouting out ahead of their damned charges. Overall, I think that this one's got an enormous amount of fun factor, basically dark packs but with knights and paid with by the souls of their luckless mortal followers. It does seem like it genuinely does a lot to empower certain Titanic knights, in particular things like the dual Gatling cannon despoiler seem scary, particularly with access to lethal hits. He just becomes a very general purpose gun turret, only really falling down against things with 2+ saves or very high toughness, for which hopefully you still have plenty of good thermal spears or war dog carnivores to put a hole in those. Cheap cultists seem pretty perfect as allies to do the grunt work, having sticky objectives and a low points cost are both great things for Chaos Knights. They do make some trade-offs with the Index one. You no longer really have anywhere near as good access to their army rule, given that you don't have the make people test on any damaged unit sort of thing. And missing Diabolic Bulwark and Walk Through Walls are 2 big ones. Overall seems usable and interesting though. I do think it has its strengths, even if I'd still guess that it's probably not going to be the competitive way to play Chaos Knights. The idea of feeding the immortal souls as sacrifices to your Gatling guns just sounds all very Chaos Knight and disturbing though. Next up, we've got the Blood Angels Angelic Inheritors. This one was an interesting one where their characters get inspired by the Primarch himself, and for their core rule, character units get 2 additional buffs, usually a reroll to hit and wound of 1 unless damage doesn't matter, and that applies at both range and melee, and then plus either fallback and charge or reroll advances and charges, both of which are pretty powerful movement boosts. For their stratagems, they've got lethal hits in melee plus lance if there's a character around, a sustained hits 1 shooting 1, a character unit can't be shot within 18 inches, 1 extra unit getting those buffs that isn't a character unit, and the ability for jump pack units to return to reserves. Finally, for enhancements, we've got a Scout 6 inches one, which could allow you some scary angels into the midboard, a Prevent Overwatch one, and a Revive on Death one. Overall, it definitely feels like it has some pretty interesting stuff for a mixed shooting and melee Blood Angel army, rather than going all in on the close combat such as the Liberator Assault group. It definitely feels like it's a detachment that just pushes you towards a few very scary character-led units. That isn't always all that different from how Blood Angels play now. The detachment rule with the big rerolls does have a bit of anti-synergy with certain units that have them built in, maybe things like Death Company or anything twin-linked or Oath of Moment for example. It just feels like certain things profit quite a lot more than others, maybe things like Hellblasters for example. They seem pretty nice here, and it seems fairly well made for Sanguinary Guard as well, particularly given that they went down in cost recently. Versus the other detachments, I'd rate kind of usable. They're competing against the really quite strong Liberator Assault group. I still think that just with the sheer strength of that detachment, it's probably still going to be the way to go. I'm kind of surprised at just how close they came to the strength of that though with this one. It definitely feels like you could make this one work as an alternative. It's got a very good damage buff as the core rule, just not appropriate for every unit. And plenty of the stratagems are really quite interesting as well, as is that Scouts enhancement. You guys gave it a 3.2 for power, maybe a little bit on the mid-side with a 3.3 for fun factor rating, maybe not doing anything enormously creative, at least compared with some of the other things out there. Next up for the Dark Angels, we've got the Lion's Blade. This is the one where Deathwing get a +2 to charge against something in melee with Ravenwing units, and units must take a Desperate Escape test if they're falling back from the Ravenwing. For stratagems, we've got a Walk Through Walls 1 for Ravenwing Bikers, some durability debuffs in the fight phase, a +1 to wound when they're within 12 inches of Ravenwing, which is kind of brutal in the shooting phase, and a big 2 command point charge out of sequence 1, which could be kind of brutal if the enemy puts things within 6 inches. That could cause a bit of area denial there. For the enhancements, they have a +1 damage to the bearer's weapons, which is fairly nice, and a few of the other ones are alright. I feel like this one looks better than it did at the start of the month, given that Ravenwing got a whole bunch of buffs and Outriders got some help. Certainly seems a bit better now that Outriders actually hit a bit harder and you might actually genuinely want to charge them into combat as support. The core Dark Angels detachments have their problems at the moment, so there's not quite so much competition from them. Pre-updates Dark Angels lists tended to be all about the Gladius task force. I guess they probably still will be, though that took a rather big nerf in terms of fire discipline being toned down. But access to melee buffs and advance and charge and the other good stuff is generally pretty handy. It is kind of interesting that you could just largely build around that +1 to wound shooting stratagem and help out a gunline army, though I guess maybe that doesn't look quite as good by comparison to, say, core Codex Space Marines now who can have that on Oath of Moment. In any case, I think there's enough stuff to be interesting here. Pretty cool to have something that actually incentivizes mixed Dark Angels with specific rules for Deathwing and Ravenwing. You guys gave this one a 2.9 for power and a 3.4 for fun factor. Finally, for the ones that I've rated kind of usable is the Space Marine Librarius Conclave. This one's the fully Librarian focused one. Psykers give their units one of 5 different attachment buffs each turn, which are either damage rerolls, a +2 move, a shooting AP buff, a -1 to the strength of enemy ranged weapons, or an ignore modifiers one. Lots of those are definitely usable in the right situation. The damage buff seems absolutely fine. I feel like there's often going to be turns when one of the rest is better. Then their stratagems give you things like a -2 to move and charge, a +1 strength in the fight phase, mortal wounds at 18 inches, a shooting lethal hits, and a -1 to hit one. And then all of them have various other boosted effects as well, depending on which of the disciplines that you went with this turn. And it does mean that the choice of those could sometimes be a bit complicated, weighing up what the core buff will give you, but also the stratagem and enhancement options it would give. Then finally for the enhancements, they've got a reactive move one, advance and charge one, a can't overwatch me one, and perhaps most notably an anti-vehicle and monster 5+ one for their unit, which can be given to stern guards to give a ridiculous spike of devastating wounds and one of the biggest scariest mortal wound combos in the game. Again, they all have further buffs depending on the discipline. For a Librarian detachment, I feel like they actually managed to make this one surprisingly good, though you would have to basically make a whole load of character heavy units to get lots of them on the board, otherwise it's not going to quite reach critical mass to the point where it's worth it versus something else. You'd almost certainly want a massive block of stern guards to do that hilarious mortal wound damage, but otherwise there's all manner of cool combos that you can do, certainly with divergent chapters thrown into the mix. Inner Circle Companions already get on pretty well with Librarians given an invul save, and Deathwatch Terminators with those Cyclone missile launchers look pretty savage with reroll 1s to hit and wound and sustain hits from a Termi Librarian. Definitely feels interesting enough to make work if you want to. Really quite powerful rules, though you can't really have everything in play at once due to the choice of that discipline. And maybe just a little bit on the limited side with the units that it supports. Really quite fun stuff though overall. You guys gave it a 3.3 for fun factor and a 2.9 for power. Moving onwards and upwards, next up we have the Tower Empire Auxiliary Cadre. These are the ones that have sort of placed at the sort of usable to strong sort of level for their various different factions. They're sort of Tau working in concert with their auxiliaries, the auxiliaries granting extra AP to Tau shooting nearby units, and Tau can make the auxiliaries harder to hit with a can't shoot me at 18 inches buff to anything close to Tau things. Pretty much all of the stratagems seem interesting as well. Auxiliaries can either reroll all wound rolls or gain extra AP. They can advance, shoot and charge, or just advance and shoot for regular Tau things, which is also great, or do an auto advance 6 inches. There's a fallback at the end of the fight phase, which is absolutely great for certain Tau shooting, and good for Krutox Rampagers lining up another charge. And Tau shooting can get a +2 strength if there's auxiliaries there to mark the way. Between all that, it feels like the Rampagers are just ridiculously well supported, extra AP and reroll wounds on offer, plus longer charges. You can't use all of them at once, but you can use the right one for the job at the time. Finally, for enhancements, they've got Deep Strike Kroot Carnivores, a Kroot unit gaining 4 greater good, so a Lone Spear could be used as a spotter if you really wanted, or perhaps the most fun one, a first turn Deep Strike for Tau commanders near auxiliaries. Overall, I feel like it did perhaps surprisingly well for supporting both Tau and Kroot things, extra AP and +2 strength possibilities, plus being able to fall back and shoot with other stuff is nice, and it means that even a buffed 3-man squad of Rampagers could absolutely tear enemies apart on the counter charge, and maybe be a bit safer from enemies shooting at longer range while they're doing so. I've rated it kind of usable to strong. Seems that you guys went a little bit lower with a 3 out of 5 for the power rating, though scored it pretty highly for the fun factor at a big 3.8 there. Next up for the Tyranids, we've got the Warrior Bioform Onslaught. The Tyranid Warriors oddly having taken a bit of a backseat in the actual core codex, but it seems that this is the place to try and make them work. The detachment gives them a 5+ invulnerable save, and they gain the Battle Line keyword and OC3, so you can take loads of them, and they're a bit sturdier and good on objectives. For stratagems, there's a +2 strength at range or +1 strength in melee for warriors, the ability to revive a slain warrior, a sticky objectives one, a strip cover one, and a durability one with a -1 to wound versus higher strength shooting. For enhancements, there's an advance and charge one, which seems like exactly what the melee warriors want with an attached winged prime. There's a -1 to hit, a Neurotyrant leader option, and a +1 to hit one. Overall, it's certainly not the most general purpose detachment out there, though it does seem to do enough to make melee warriors into a genuine mainline threat. They do have plenty of damage that can tear down most things here, and having the invulnerable save and the -1 to wound stratagem, I feel does at least something to make them less horribly fragile. It does seem that someone's already managed to win a small grand tournament with them. It's with one of the more impressive performances for a Grotmas detachment so far. It does feel like the sort of detachment though where you need an absolute ton of warriors to make it work. If you get them just through Games Workshop, then it'd be a ridiculously pricey list. It feels like it'd be more practically in the reach of people with 3D printers and stuff, or have ridiculously well established Tyranids armies. I think it's still nice enough in a way that it makes a very different archetype of Tyranid army pretty usable. It does seem fairly fun and solid to me, though again I still expect it to be more niche versus things like say Invasion Fleet or Vanguard Onslaught. For the votes, you guys rated it at a fun factor of 3.5 and a power rating of 3.3. Next up, we've got the Astra Militarum Bridgehead Strike. This one was the Scion Flavoured Guard Detachment. Infantry gets 2 reroll hit rolls of 1 here, just full stop. And Militarum Tempestus units get a +1 to wound when they've either got out of transports or deep struck, and the Scions themselves get OC2 and Battle Line if there's a Tempestus Warlord. All of that's trading out the lethal hits that you get for Born Soldiers though, so it's quite a big trade-off. For their special rules though, they get a 6-inch drop, a hotshot weapon boost stratagem, an advance and shoot one which works on regular guard things like tanks too, an ignores cover debuff handed out by an infantry unit, and a return to reserve for Tempestus units, which could be kind of fun. Finally, for enhancements, there's a triple order issue one with a big bombastic Vox, a turn 1 deep strike which seems like a good option, a prevent overwatch one, and one to redeploy a bunch of units. Again, I'd say that this one's interesting, though needs an absolutely massive skew list to really make it viable. Probably something like 40+ Tempestus Scions at a minimum at 2,000 points, and possibly more. The damage combos that you can unload with them are really quite serious. In a combo video I did recently, they can put out some kind of ridiculous shooting with a Scion Command Squad getting out of a Taurox Prime alongside a Scion Squad. Could certainly do some terrifying Alpha Strike things, even if they're pretty fragile in return. It did feel a bit odd to me as well that this one wasn't in the Codex, given that it feels like a pretty core guard army archetype. I'm not sure why they decided to make this one a Grotmas one when they've only put 5 detachments in the Codex. Overall though, I'd rate it as usable to strong. It does feel like it's harder to use than the standard guard detachment, and as I said I think needs a really specific list to do well, otherwise it's just not going to be worth the trade-off. It seems pretty nice for Tempestus Scion players, though this one would have been stronger before the Scion nerf where they went up in points a bit. You guys voted this one pretty much the same as the Tyranids, a 3.5 for fun factor and a 3.3 for power. Next up, we've got some Demons of Khorne with their Blood Legion. The core rule giving you a d6-inch surge move when enemies move close to you, so potentially they move up within 6 inches, and then there's a good chance that they might wind up in close combat if they do. That will certainly make people think twice about whether or not they move up to steal your objectives, and create a bit more of an exclusion zone around the army, and more so than the Space Wolves one potentially. It feels like perhaps the real strength of the detachment is in the stratagems though. They've got lots of nice melee support, advance and charge a unit that fell back within 6 inches and keep them in combat basically, a 4+ fight on death, a move through terrain one which would be nice for bloodthirsters, a Khorne grenade style one, and a 3+ armor save which is fun, bullets bouncing off a whole bunch of freshly grown brass plates for some bloodletters. Then for enhancements they've got a lance melee one, a reroll hits and wounds at the cost of d3+1 wounds for a bloodthirster or demon prince, which does seem absolutely savage though takes a bunch of damage in return, a nice +2 to charges so you can still have some charges out of deep strike, potentially on a 6-inch with bloodletter or blood crusher instruments, and a fun deadly demise on a 2+1 as well, which could be pretty explosive for a bloodthirster. Overall, between the strats and enhancements, it feels like a pretty solid melee support package for Khornate Violence. Most of their units are fairly solid already. Bloodletters went down a bit too, which didn't hurt. They will likely miss their 6-inch deep strikes a bit though, with Bloodthirsters jumping forward and then dropping either Blood Crushers or Bloodletters on them. Overall though, seems interesting enough. If you were playing a fairly heavy Khorne army already or wanted to make them work, then I feel like this one looks like it's pretty viable. And you guys gave it a fun factor of 3.6 and voted power rating of 3.4. Never wanting to be outdone by Khorne though, the Slaanesh Demons got their Legion of Excess, and they got a kind of brutally powerful core rule. Their charging units have the option to give up fights first for the massive damage buff of 4 rerolls to hit and wounds in melee if you choose to, and that makes all of their units just so much more dangerous in close combat, particularly with lots of devastating wounds about. They also have fallback and charge as well, so if they're locked in an ongoing combat, they could still use this to trigger that again. Then for stratagems, they've got a rather tricksy one to transfer damage from one unit to another within 12 inches, to basically guarantee that one thing lives that needs to. A big +1 to wound in melee, though that is 2 CP. A walk through walls one, which is absolutely great for the threat range of Keepers of Secrets or maybe Shalaxi Hellbane. A mortal wound impact hits one, if you want to make sure that the enemy doesn't hit you back too hard. And a battle shock at -1 to the test to prevent shooting at a unit, which actually has a disturbingly high chance to have to force the opponent to reallocate if they really wanted to gun down one given unit. For enhancements, I feel like the +1 to wound for non-monsters within 6 inches is quite a nice one. Plus the healing for monsters killing things in close combat is fairly nice, and could account for a few more wounds stacked back onto a keeper. Overall, it's definitely an interesting detachment. The detachment rule definitely comes with trade-offs though, and you wouldn't always be able to make use of it, particularly against things that can fight somewhat hard in melee. It does seem very nasty on Keepers of Secrets though, and particularly if you're charging things like enemy gun tanks that can't fight so hard in close combat, though some of the other stratagems and enhancements really help out Fiends and Demonettes as well. Overall, I feel like this one does enough to make Mono Slaanesh look really quite scary. It genuinely looks like it could be a competitive alternative for Demons. I put it on the usable to strong sort of scale, maybe leaning towards the strong side of things. You guys gave it a 3.5 for both fun and power rating. Next up, for the Chaos Space Marines, they got the creations of the Spider with the creations of Bile Detachment. The core rule gets you either to pick one buff on a table of infantry style boosts, or you get to roll 2 of them randomly, by allowing you to have a reroll, which does seem well worth it if you're going random. Most of them are pretty solid, though just having a random 2 might risk being less helpful. Though I feel like if you just literally pick one, it just feels a bit more underwhelming as a detachment rule versus say Renegade Raiders. For stratagems, they've got a bunch of things that can help out some infantry melee. There's a -1 to hit infantry, a fights on death on a 4+, a heal a destroyed model or D3 battle line, which could be fun on obliterators, and an advance and charge one. Really quite a good support of melee stratagems there. For the enhancements, probably my favourite one is the +1 damage and reroll hit rolls for an infantry character. That feels all very solid on a Chaos Lord. Overall, between the stratagems, +1 fun buff from the core rule of one sort or another, it does feel like a pretty nice Chaos melee rush support. Good for Possessed and Chosen, maybe Chaos Terminators or Legionaries. Probably wanting some Obliterators to make use of the +1 ballistic skill if you happen to roll that one. Again, it does seem to be one of the ones that has at least done alright in tournaments already. I think I saw at least one result posted for them. Again, I guess it's probably not going to become the dominant Chaos detachment over Renegade Raiders personally at this point. Though it definitely seems strong enough that it'll continue to see a whole bunch of competitive play. I think they've done pretty well with it. The random rolls do give you a bit of fun factor that actually seem like they might be worth actually making use of. You guys seem to be pretty impressed with it on both counts, a 3.9 for the fun factor for a whole bunch of chaos violence running at you, and a 3.6 for power. Next up, we've got some big golden dreadnoughts in the Adepta Custodes Solar Spearhead. The core rule for this one helps out vehicle units, giving you extra OC for undamaged vehicles, and then reroll damage boost if the vehicle has taken wounds, and then dreadnoughts specifically get a +2 inches to their move, a +1 to advance and charge, and 2 can be characters that can be given enhancements. To me, the extra move distance maybe feels like a bit of a band-aid. I kind of think that should have just maybe been baked into their core stat line. For their stratagems, they've got some nice damage and durability ones, a -1 to wound a vehicle, a fights on death for a 4+, a move through walls for a vehicle or mounted thing, which could be really quite nice for getting Virtus Praetors to close combat if you'd like to, and an advance and shoot for a vehicle, going to advance, shoot and charge for a walker, which again is very nice for getting dreadnoughts into the fray, particularly with the detachment rule of +2 to move and +1 to advance and charge. It means that you could have some fancy Forge World Contemptors right into your battle line very quickly. For the enhancements, I quite like the Adamantine Talisman one, which would be for an infantry character, giving you something like a very big damage blade champion, and a vehicle can act as a reroll source for infantry, allowing you to reroll hit rolls of 1. Overall, I think that this one seems pretty solidly usable. I think that it looks successful in that it does enough to make the dreadnoughts looking far more interesting, though I feel like with the raw stats of them, they're maybe going to still have some stiff competition from things like Wardens and Blade Champions. It's maybe a little bit unfortunate that they haven't got round to redoing Forge World Dreadnoughts in plastic yet. That's going to be one big criticism, that most of the Custodes vehicles are locked to Forge World, and that's not that helpful for people who have gone for the plastic side of the army, myself included. Making those dreadnoughts faster though definitely does a lot to help their viability. Overall, versus other things like Shield Host and Talons, they generally do more for the more mainline units of the Custodes. I still think that they're probably going to be the go-to in terms of what most people use, particularly Shield Host, though I feel like this one's definitely interesting. I certainly think it'll get played far more than Auric Champions or Normaiden Vigil. You guys voted it a 3.6 for fun factor and a 3.3 for power. Next up, as part of the Grotmas Detachments, we got the Death Watch, where as well as just their Black Spear detachment, they also got all their index rules as well, gaining their Primaris kill teams back and their Terminator datasheet once again, often with some interesting rules revisions. For the Black Spear detachment itself, you get 3 turns of mission tactics with damage buffs, stratagems including a teleportarium to remove a unit from the board or multiple kill teams, flexing mission tactics, which is rather nice, and special issue ammunition stratagems that no longer have a bolt weapon restriction, and the Primaris mixed kill teams do have some fairly savage shooting with boosted Deathwatch bolter profiles. For their enhancements, the Tome of Ectoclades still looks good with the double oath of moment that it can bring, free rapid ingress and deep strike is nice with the Beacon Angelis, and the big melee buff with the Thief of Secrets is well worth including on a fighty character. Overall, it was broadly a pretty well received index, maybe a little bit of a return to the status quo before the Agents of the Imperium Codex came out. I think it was a big win to see those Primaris kill teams back and actually looking kind of interesting now, and that Terminator datasheet getting the bunch of Cyclone missile launchers seems weirdly strong too. The detachment looks fairly similar, though broadly I think it's got a bit more meaningful. Having 3 stratagem slots devoted to special issue ammunition still maybe feels a touch limiting, though at least you'd think about using them a bit more than before though. Overall, I still feel that there's a pretty good chance that this is how people choose to play with Deathwatch, given a little bit of extra support for the kill teams. Feels like those Primaris kill teams could have a bunch of good combos and other stuff as well if you really wanted. I feel like they might actually do rather well with the Librarius Conclave one. As mentioned earlier, particularly Terminator Librarians with the Deathwatch Terminators for a massive amount of damage, plus a couple of the on-foot Librarians with their kill teams. Overall looks pretty solid. It was quite nice to have more support for a Deathwatch army beyond just Codex Agents of the Imperium. You guys voted them a 3.3 for power rating and a 3.6 for fun factor once again, maybe a bit upper middle on both there. For the Drukhari next, we've got the Reaper's Wager. This one is the Drukhari plus Harlequin allied detachment, where it's got a pretty curious attachment rule where one half of the army is losing the wager and getting reroll 1s to hit and wound when they do so, and it flips between the other side of the army each time you actually fully destroy a unit. Overall, it's basically a really quite big army-wide damage buff, but only up until the point that one half of your army destroys something. For their stratagems, they've got quite a lot of nice melee support ones, lethal or sustained hits when either shooting or fighting, a 4+ fights on death, an infantry reactive move one, though kind of pricey at 2 CP, a nice advance and charge, and one to prevent overwatch, which is fairly cool. For the stronger enhancements, there seems like a pretty pivotal one to be able to flip the one that is winning the wager from one side to the other with a pain token mechanic, which could just mean that you could have pretty much an entirely Drukhari army and just keep flipping it back so you get the army-wide damage buffs up to the point of actually killing something, which does seem kind of fierce on paper. A 9-inch scout move in a transport could set up for a massive alpha strike, and stealth and infiltrate harlequins again could have a big threatening unit take up residence in the midpoint of the board. Overall, I certainly agree that this one looks like really quite a fun detachment, a pretty random but also fairly well impactful detachment rule, genuinely good support for melee units, and some enhancements that are meaningful enough to want to take. It is going to require Aeldari players to have a very certain collection though, or Drukhari players scrape together some Harlequins if you want a token thing to make use of some of them, and I feel like the actual Harlequin datasheets are maybe a little bit on the mid side here, outside of the Aeldari detachment where they can get some inbuilt rerolls to hit and wound whenever they do any damage. Overall though, I feel like this one's maybe a little bit underrated for strength, perhaps feels like it'd be something that's pretty high skill and maybe very dependent on line of sight blocking terrain and playing carefully with fragile melee units, but could be made to work by someone who really knows the army well. I gave it a usable to strong personally, though it looks like you guys have rated it a little bit more mid, with a 3-star one there, though definitely rated it for fun factor on a big 3.8. Next up, we've got the Grey Knight Warpbane Task Force. This one's the sort of cleansing, purifying flame Grey Knight force, led by purifiers, and working kind of similar to the Thousand Suns, taking zones of control of the board depending on what objectives you hold. You get some nice hallowed ground, and purify squads also get an aura of it. You get 2 reroll hit rolls of 1 outside of it, and reroll all hit rolls within that hallowed ground. That second bit is seriously nasty for an army hitting on a 3+, meaning that Dread Knights and things would often be getting a flat 33% damage boost whenever they're within that ground. For stronger stratagems, purifiers can reroll all wound rolls, which is pretty mighty, makes them from being a far more middling threat to a high threat unit. There's some mortal wound shenanigans to enemies nearby or when enemies move, a reactive 4+ invulnerable save, a 6-inch deep strike within hallowed ground, and one that can debuff charges. For enhancements, there's a stealth to infantry one, which is kind of annoying that characters can't join purifiers so easily, a personal mortal wound melee buff, and a once per game option to automatically put a unit into hallowed ground, which I guess could be nice enough if you're having to venture outside of that. As it goes, it definitely makes some massive trade-offs with the teleport strike force, lacking things like Mists of Deimos, the Sigil of Exigence, or very fast-moving Dread Knights, but what it does give in return is some fairly enormous direct damage boosts to things like Dread Knights, Purifiers, or just anything in general within hallowed ground. It's maybe not exactly the hardest buff to get as well, if you can project it with some small Purifier squads hiding, and then help out everything nearby. It seems that in terms of fun factor, you guys have rated it lower than most, not really quite liking the grab objectives to gain reroll sort of thing. Maybe it does feel a little bit direct, though it's rated 3.4 in terms of power. I feel like it looks a lot better versus the Index Detachment after the balanced data slate, when it took some rather key nerfs to things like the 3-inch deep strike, which became 6, and the True Silver Armour of Contempt equivalent, which just got a bit worse. Moving on, finally we've got the detachments that just feel outright strong and might have a fairly good chance of being fairly top tier for their factions, looking solid alongside the best that they can offer right now. Out of the previous, I probably would have been most debating about putting the Creations of Bile one up here as well. In any case, first up we have the Admech Halo Screed one. This one's the one where a Tech Priest from afar assumes direct control over a unit of one sort or another. You pick a certain amount of squads, and they gain either +2 move, +1 toughness, advance and charge, or stealth. It seems that at the moment that can also work on knights as well. I'm not sure whether or not that was intended. Again, could kind of vary turn by turn. The advance and charge one seems very directly useful for a few units though. Otherwise, for the stratagems, they're quite nicely general purpose. There's reroll hit rolls and wounds of 1 for Halo units. Critical hits on a 5+, which is brutal on Cataphrone breaches with a Manipulus attached. There's a gain and override one, which could be quite nice and could allow a bit more flexibility. A disembark and charge one for getting some melee things up close and personal out of a Dune Rider. Fallback shoot and charge, which is pretty nasty on mainline damage dealers such as Cataphrons or Castellans, and some nice reactive moves as well, which are always handy. For enhancements, there's a very nice one to allow Castellans to get the Doctriners and the Overrides all at the same time, which I think is enough to actually make them genuinely quite credible alongside their points cut. There's a great one for gaining both Conqueror and Protector Doctriners, which seems pretty awesome for Cataphron breaches, making them faster and more dangerous at the same time. A +6-inch range and reroll hazardous ones, which seems nice for the Plasma Destroyers on paper, and even a Tech Priest melee one, which also seems alright. Overall, it just seems that every single bit of this is really quite solid and also nicely general purpose, so you're not just being locked to Skitarii units and can make a bit more use out of the robots and the battle servitors too. And I quite like the sort of fun factor of a shadowy tech priest assuming control from afar and sort of kind of pseudo-possessing units to do what he wants. It does seem like this one's got quite a lot of draw versus the other Admech detachments, Skitarii Hunter cohort being the main competitor. I feel like it's just a quite nice feeling one, both seeming rather powerful and very general purpose. You guys raised it a little bit higher for power versus fun factor, though not by too much. Next up, we've got the Wrath of Khorne detachment for the World Eaters, and the idea behind this one is that 3 champions or non-epic hero characters gain an extra blessing that you can choose directly when you do your Blessings of Khorne roll, and it means that you can fairly heavily double dip on them, taking extra damage at the same time as extra movement, or any combo of that and the defense and the fights and death. It means that you can absolutely rely on the advance and charge as well if you need it, which is kind of scary given how much that can increase your threat range, but you don't always roll it. Otherwise, for stratagems, there's a +1 strength and AP one for berserkers and jackals near characters, a reroll wounds against monsters and vehicles, which is pretty brutal as well, a -1 to wound versus shooting, the ability to force desperate escape tests at -1 to test, and a blood surge one when damaged. For enhancements, there's a damage dealer with better AP and damage by 1 if they're a vessel, a walk through walls one which seems quite nice for the Juggernaut Lord to keep with the squad, a fights on death on a 2+, and farming command points for slaying enemy units if you happen to. Overall, it does seem like really quite a solid one, very reliable speed and blessings, and the stratagems seem suitably good to rival the core ones in the index, which are also very powerful. If anything, flavour-wise, this one maybe feels like a bit of a counter-shooting detachment, maybe compare with the index one, between things like the surge moves, the -1 to wound versus shooting, and forcing desperate escape tests. Between that and the super fast speed, it feels like it might just get on better against ranged armies versus melee compared with the index version. Otherwise, maybe the biggest weakness is that the things don't really tend to work on Angron very much. He'd just have to carry his own weight with his datasheet strength, though I feel like he's certainly still adequately strong to run here if you want to. Overall, seems like a really strong detachment, looks like it's pretty viable compared with the index one, though maybe not enormously different in terms of theming. It feels like it's going down a similar sort of line with blessing buffs, just maybe a little bit more focused on the infantry units as opposed to everything like vehicles and epic heroes. In any case, you guys voted this one a 3.7 for fun factor and a 3.8 for power. Next up, we've got Orky orders with the Tactical Brigade. This one I really liked, with war bosses and big mechs and things being able to yell at their orcs for a +1 to hit at range, giving them stealth and cover, a fairly nice +1 strength in melee, or the ability to reroll charges, potentially giving their unit 2 of those buffs, at the risk of taking some damage and mortal wounds if they fail a morale test. Those have big potential, particularly the +1 to hit for things like flash kits, though all the rest are good. Rerolling charges and +1 strength in melee is definitely all very nice for getting your unit stuck into combat nicely. Stealth and cover will definitely make boys mobs in the open a bit more of a slog to chew through as well. Storm boys also gain battle line here too, that feels like a bit more of a side benefit. For stratagems, you can either get sustained or lethal hits in melee, Storm boys can have mortal wound impact hits or return to reserve, and there's a fallback and shoot and charge one. I'd say that in general maybe these stratagems seem a little bit more mid compared with some detachments though. Perhaps the enhancements are on a bit of another level though, particularly the big mech joining flash kits and giving them all reroll hits. With that and the flash kits and a shock attack gun, you then get a shooting unit that can just pulverise the majority of enemy things, and also go on to still be a pretty hefty threat in melee on top of that. Otherwise there's an orders at 18 inches one, a warboss can join commandos if you'd like to, and a redeploy units. Overall though, mainly due to the core rule, it just feels like really quite a strong and flexible one, has a bit of help with scoring things with Storm Boys jumping on and off the board to do secondaries, and still fights very hard in melee for the units that need to, with the +1 strength, reroll charges, and getting lethal hits whenever you need to. That super scary unit of flash kits with a shock attack gun mech seems like an auto-include, and you could have more flash kits provided you've got things to order them with. Overall, looks like it's got enough draw to be good alongside the other Orc detachments. I guess that it's probably going to be stronger than most, and probably giving a bit of rivaling of Warhorde. In any case, this one seems to be rather loved by the Orky community out there, getting the highest single score for fun factor at 4.3, and also being rated as one of the more powerful ones as well at a 3.9. Finally though, and perhaps a bit of return to the glory days of the Necrons shattering some stars, we have the Necron Star Shatter Arsenal, where they've had their strongest attachment in the Hypercrypt nerfed in a fairly big way in the balance update, though just in time for this to come to the fore. In theory this one's the Necron Vehicle detachment that does quite a few things for other stuff too. The core rule gives you all of your units a +1 to hit against units on objectives, which is pretty powerful given that your opponent's going to have to put things there to be able to take them, and then vehicles and mounted units gain the assault keyword, so a bit more speed for their shooting. Their stratagems are really nice, a +1 to wound against things on objectives, which isn't bit locked to vehicles or mounted, a -1 to wound for your detachment units, or very nice on Doomsday Arcs or the Silent King, activating reanimation again, which could lead to another 4 wounds or so restored if there's a Canoptek reanimator nearby, a reactive move after enemies have shot you to potentially move a unit from in line of sight to out of it, a move through terrain one which can allow detachment units to burst through walls such as the Silent King, and an auto advance 6 if you desperately need that extra movement to either gain an objective or line of sight or something. Then their enhancements are seriously good as well. Reroll 1s to hit and wound as an aura means that you could have a Catacomb Command Barge be a mini Silent King, and that's absolutely fine just as a squad buff as well. There's an ignores cover for maybe some immortal shooting or similar, and a -1 damage for a vehicle or mounted unit, which is pretty good on things like Doomsday Arcs or Destroyers, though again just seems rather intimidating when applied to the Silent King. Between that and a potential -1 to wound and boosted reanimation, lots of armies aren't really going to be able to kill him in a practical way. Overall, as a result, it's perhaps looking like the single strongest attachment on paper. Lots of things can help out things that aren't vehicles, such as potentially a +1 to hit and wound against things on objectives for literally anything. Even the Catan will enjoy the +1 to wound, and could also be given the rerolls of 1 to hit and wound, which is rather brutal. The Silent King and Doomsday Arc seems like they're going to be near auto-include status, and I feel like Imhotep the Stormlord would also be really popular for his command point farming, even if it doesn't make much lore sense for him to be fighting alongside the Silent King. Compared with the other Necron detachments, and particularly with the Hybrid Crypts being nerfed a bit, this one's looking very strong, and maybe more so than the rest. It's perhaps the only one that really feels like it's probably head and shoulders above the others in terms of power level, where maybe a bunch of the others feel like more solid options that could be a good alternative to the current best. It'd be interesting to see if it does quite as much scary stuff as it seems to do in paper though. It does seem like it does enough with the amount of units that the Necrons have at their disposal, plus the really good datasheets like the Silent King and Doomsday Arcs, and a few others though. You guys didn't give it all that much a fun factor rating, down at 3.4 there, but it was voted as the single highest for power rating at a big 4.4, certainly a fair ways ahead of the rest. In any case though, I'll certainly be interested to hear your guys' takes on the detachments. Do you think that any of them are a bit underrated or overblown? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments. It'll certainly be interesting to take a look at what people are using in tournaments and things when events start up in earnest again in January. As mentioned earlier, a big thank you to Toy Snowman for sponsoring the video. If you happen to live in Canada, they can do Warhammer things for 15% off Games Workshop's prices. There'll be links down in the video description below, so feel free to check them out, and they can do back orders for things that you can't see in stock as mentioned. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you'd like to support the channel and keep the videos coming, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.